this video we'll be taking a look at the performance of Devil May Cry 5 on both old and newish hardware. First off, I'm not very good at this game, as you may catch a glimpse of in the background, but I expect you didn't come here for good gameplay. At least I hope you didn't, in which case you'll be disappointed. So the CPUs are the usual suspects: the FX8350 at 4.5 GHz, the FX6300 at 4.5 GHz, the Phenom II X6 1090T at 3.8 GHz, the Ryzen R5 1600 at 3.7 GHz, and the i5 6600K at 4.8 GHz. The older gen CPUs from AMD run 16GB of DDR3 memory at 1600 MHz, while the Ryzen and i5 run 16GB of 3200 MHz DDR4 memory. The game supports both DX11 and DX12, however there is no in-game setting for this, well, at least as far as I have seen. The game chooses for you, and for me it chose DirectX 11. To change this, you have to go to the game folder in your Steam library, open the config file, and from there you can change it to DirectX 12 or 11 if you feel like it. The first sets of benchmarks are from a cutscene, as the cutscenes are rendered in real time. And these are all in DirectX 11. You see, I didn't realize until I had finished my first set of benchmark that I was in DirectX 11. So that's my bad. We will take a look at DirectX 11 versus DirectX 12 a bit later in the video, but those benchmarks will be restricted to 1080p. But the benchmarks we're going to look at now from the cutscenes are in 1080p, 1440p and 4K. The cutscenes are a sort of a worst case scenario, because you do get significantly higher frame rates while actually playing the game. So to kick things off, we have the R5 and i5 with the GTX 1070, 1660 Ti and the R9 290. In addition to this, we also have the i5 and Pentium 4620 with the GTX 1050. So here we can see that in the cutscenes the performance of both CPUs are nearly identical, with pretty much all the GPUs we tested. Well, they are pretty much completely identical. But in addition to that, we can see that the 1660 Ti matched the GTX 1070 performance of 104 frames per second on average. The old R9 290 shows that it's still a capable GPU with 69 frames per second on average, and the GTX 1050 is rather struggling here with an average of 36.8 frames per second, but that is to be expected with all the settings on max and an entry-level GPU. Moving on to 1440p, the GTX 1070 and 1660 Ti is still performing on par, with just over 70 frames per second on average, with almost identical frame times. The R9 290 is falling below 60 frames per second here, with an average of around 49 frames per second, and frankly, I didn't even bother testing the GTX 1050 at this resolution. Well, 4K numbers are up next, and here the R9 290 also falls away, so we're only looking at the GTX 1070 and 1660 Ti here, which still perform identically with both CPUs at 39 frames per second on average. Now we're going to move on to testing the different CPUs with the different GPUs. So we start off with the R9 290 at 1080p, and here all the CPUs managed to hang with the R9 290. Both the i5 and R5 is coming out slightly ahead of the others, but not by much. And the frame times with the R5 was the tightest, however. On to 1440p, and this paints a slightly wrong picture. You see on the first look it looks as if though the old AMD CPUs are outperforming the newer CPUs, but that's not really the case. You see, Virtual Super Resolution, or VSR, was not working with the display I was using with the old test system. In other words, with the test system for the FX and Phenom. So I used the in-game render scaling set to 130% as it moves in increments of 10. So 133% would be identical to 1440p, so these old CPUs are running slightly lower resolution, which is why they are coming out ahead. But at least it is apparent that they are not bottlenecking the GPU. All CPUs did around 50 frames per second on average, and there was no 4K testing with this particular GPU. So what if we put in a more powerful GPU? The GTX 1070 should show us some difference between these CPUs. At 1080p, the i5-6600K comes out ahead with 105.7 frames per second on average. The R5-1600 is right behind with 104.4 frames per second on average, but the frame times on the i5 is a bit better. Third place comes as a bit of a surprise, at least to me. It's the Phenom II X6, which managed an 82.7 frames per second on average, with only the 0.1% load dipping under 60 frames per second at 56 frames per second. The FX8350 did 77.4 frames per second on average, with both the 1% and 0.1% load dipping well under 60 frames per second at 42.4 and 36.8 frames per second respectively. The FX8350 did 73.6 frames per second on average, with frame times about the same as the 8350. Moving up to 1440p levels out the playing field a bit. The R5 and i5 is still ahead with 72 frames per second on average and a 1% low of 55 frames per second and a 0.1% low of 53 frames per second. The older CPUs are running slightly behind at 68 frames per second on average with a 1% low of 44 frames per second and a 0.1% low of around 40 frames per second. Moving to 4K, everything evens out, and all the CPUs manage just under 40 frames per second on average. Checking out the GTX 1660 Ti's performance, and well, as we have seen before, the performance is pretty much exactly the same as the 1070, with the R5 and i5 at 105 frames per second on average, the 1090 Ti outperforming the FX CPUs at both average and frame times, as we saw with the 1070. If we up the resolution to 1440p, things are still the same as with the 1070. And here again, the R5 and i5 is coming out on top with 71.4 frames per second on average, while the other CPUs are coming in right behind at just under 70 frames per second on average. And well, if we move things up to 4K, things are pretty much exactly the same, and all CPUs are doing just under 40 frames per second on average. I should actually mention that at the 4K resolution, when you play the game and not watching cutscenes, you're actually getting 60 frames per second on average, which is quite nice. Now, next we'll look at the GTX 1660 Ti and 1070 performance while overclocked at 1440p with the i5-6600K. So overclocking boosts the performance with about 10% with both GPUs. The 1070 is ever so slightly faster with 80.1 frames per second on average, and the 1660 Ti is doing 78.9 frames per second on average while overclocked. Now, we're going to take a quick look at DirectX 11 versus DirectX 12 performance while in a cutscene before moving on to performance while actually gaming or playing the game. So here I used the i5-6600K at 1080p, and surprisingly the performance is worse across the board at DirectX 12 while in a cutscene, that is. Even on the AMD card actually. The 1070 lost 2 frames per second on average, the 1660 Ti lost over twice as much at 5 frames per second on average, and the R9 290 lost about 3 frames per second on average. And it is because of these results that I started testing while playing the game instead of just testing in the cutscenes, and the results there are quite a bit different. So if we start off with the R9 290 and the i5 and Phenom II X6. Under DirectX 11, the i5-6600K did 98.8 frames per second on average to the 85 frames per second on average with the Phenom. So the Phenom can't really push more than 85 frames per second on average. Frame times was also worse on the Phenom, and switching to DirectX 12 helped the R9 290 launch ahead to an impressive 113.6 frames per second on average with the i5. In addition, the 0.1% low stayed well above 60 frames per second at 76.4 frames per second. DirectX 12 did not help the Phenom, however, which is stuck at 85 frames per second on average. But 113.6 frames per second on average on an almost 6-year-old R9 290 on max setting at a new game in 2019, that to me is quite impressive. Although this is an AMD sponsored title, but still. Switching the GPU to the GTX 1070 and testing with the i5 and R5, we see something interesting. The performance is much better with the Ryzen under DirectX 12, And the DirectX 11, the i5-6600K comes out ahead with 119.3 frames per second on average, with the R5 doing 113.5 frames per second on average. With DirectX 12, the i5-6600K increases to 123.5 frames per second on average, but the R5-1600 makes a giant leap to 143 frames per second on average, with very good frame times. And I know you must be thinking that the i5-6600K was limiting the 1070, or bottlenecking it, but that was not the case. The i5 was running at around 60% utilization and the GPU was hovering from 80 to 99%. I tried reinstalling the drivers, but that did nothing. So with DirectX 12, the performance increase with the Ryzen and the 1070 is a whopping 26% over DirectX 11. While with the i5 it was a mere 3.5% increase going from DirectX 11 to DirectX 12. Now moving on to the GTX 1660 Ti, here I decided to see how the 1090T would hold up and to see how many frames it could push with the R5 1600. So with the 1090T we still stuck at 85 frames per second on average as with the R9 290, but DirectX 11 to DirectX 12 saw about a 10% increase in performance with this CPU, going from 77.4 frames per second on average to 85 frames per second on average. Frame times was also better. But the real showstopper here is the performance with the Ryzen. DirectX 11 to DirectX 12 saw a 27% increase in performance. With DirectX 11 it managed to 117.7 frames per second on average, while with DirectX 12 that shot up to 149.9 frames per second on average, beating out the 1070 with 6.9 frames per second on average. Frame times was also excellent with the 1660 Ti, with a 0.1% low only dipping to around 100 frames per second, with 1% low at 121.7 frames per second with DirectX 12. Class A performance there with the Ryzen. This is probably something to do with the fact that this is an AMD sponsored title, and frankly I really wish I had a Vega 56 to compare with, but I don't. And that's pretty much all the benchmarks I have for you today. I tried to shorten down this video but by not reading out all the numbers because there are quite a few. So I tried to stay under 15 minutes and well, thank you for watching. Now I'm going to go hunt some demons, I think. Farewell.